Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. Really fun to see folks that in some cases I've known for years, in some cases never met before, but there are a lot of those connections. I look around and some of the faces have changed because it's been 15 years since I've seen you. I remember being here at Venture or Trinity in the past in the early years when you were in two buildings earlier, I think. Haven't been here before, so it's really fun. Fun to be here for Rob's 33rd birthday. He's going to keep doing 33 till he gets it right, so I don't know how long that will take, but it's a privilege to be able to be with you. And I have spent a lot of time thinking in the past couple years, as Mark's mentioned, in terms of both writing books, but also just in terms of other things in my life, have led me to think a lot about how we communicate Christ to other people. And so what I want to talk to you today about, as Mark mentioned, speaking Christianly. If you have a Bible, you could turn to Acts chapter 17. We'll be looking at a passage of scripture that's actually right before a passage that you're probably familiar with. So you could look at Acts chapter 17, verse 16 through 21. While you're flipping there, let me just give a quick explanation. The idea that I'm talking about of speaking Christianly, that includes things like sharing your faith, but I've realized that there's kind of a step before that, or perhaps other than that comes up a lot when you realize you have a belief or a conviction or an understanding that emerges from your Christian faith, and you're suddenly talking to someone and you realize they do not share your faith or your perspective on this issue. And you face that awkward feeling of, do I speak up? Do I speak Christianly? And the key thing there is you're talking about some area, behavior, activity, something going on in your life or in the world around you that really does emerge from your Christian faith. And you want to talk about it also Christianly. So the attitude, the disposition, the way you approach it, not just the content, should reflect Christ. And I find a lot of times we're intimidated to do that. It isn't just we're intimidated to share the gospel with someone, but we're intimidated sometimes to simply speak Christianly. Why is that? Well, one reason is we don't like conflict, right? Just people are like that would rather just get along with people. So I bring up something that people will disagree with you on. It's nicer to just avoid those sorts of things. But the other thing that happens is, like, if you're supposed to talk about Christ, there's so much to talk about that we don't know where to begin. So we don't. We think we have to share everything. We know we can't. So instead of sharing one thing, we share nothing. We don't know how to get started. And we get so concerned with all of this stuff that we end up delivering none of this stuff. Another thing that I've seen happen that I think keeps us from engaging in this is that we don't appreciate the way major purchases work, to put it in a marketing metaphor. So I remember seeing Infinity commercials. Man, I'm dating myself. So I'm old enough to remember the time before there was such a thing as an Infinity, the automobile. Infinity existed, but anyhow, you get it. So, and they had these crazy commercials. You'd sit there and there's like a river flowing through a meadow that's meadowing by some trees that are treeing, and then there's this logo that comes up that says Infinity. I don't think there's even a car in the whole thing. It told me nothing about this automobile. I didn't know where to buy one, didn't know where to get one. But you know what? The Nissan, who is the owners of Infinity, knew that we often don't, is making a major purchase is always a process. You'd never buy a car whose name you'd never know. So what's the first solution? I want you to know the name Infinity. And we're going to have an whole advertising campaign that doesn't tell you squat about our cars, but by the time we're done, you'll know our name. And then when you see a car, you might recognize it, and then one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, you're flocking to our Infinity store to buy a half a dozen. It's this incremental process of hearing little bits. And we have a way of thinking like if you share something about Christ, you have to share everything about Christ. And if you share something about Christ and it doesn't go well, or the person doesn't fall on their knees and accept Jesus, you feel like it's a failure. If Infinity had adopted that posture, they never would have started advertising, right? When it's a major purchase, you move slowly. And I hate to describe Christ as a purchase, but hopefully you get the analogy. This is a big life decision. You don't make it lightly. There's a guy at Home Depot who's been trying to sell me solar panels for like 5 years. They always have in La Habra, where I go to that home. Their guy stands right out front. I always give him the quick brush off because I'm on my way to get my 2x4s or whatever it is I'm doing there. Never even talk to the guy, but the funny thing is I know he's there. I know he works for Solar City. Sherry and I have actually been talking about, do we want to put solar panels on the house? And one day or another, I'm going to buy some solar panels, I bet. And I might just buy it from Solar City because of all the times that guy was standing there with that name on. And we have to begin to get that impression in our minds of what does it mean to speak Christianly. It doesn't always mean saying everything, but it does mean saying something. And it doesn't always mean apparent success in terms of a, quote, sale. It simply means building an awareness of who this person is and how he affects people's lives. The other thing is we have all the wrong models that come to our mind. You think of evangelism or sharing your faith, and you think of Billy Graham. I mean, I hate to break it to you. I think it's exceptionally unlikely that you actually will be the next Billy Graham. I mean, it might be. I have no privileged knowledge of this, but I'm looking at some of you guys, you're halfway to Billy Graham age already and you haven't done it. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, right? And we think of other biblical models. Elijah, up on Mount Carmel, he calls down the fire. We have grilled priests of Baal afterwards. And you get these sorts of imaginings of what is it like? And you go, well, I could never do that. And I'm like, you're right. You probably won't do it. You have the wrong set of models. I got an interesting introduction to this. I was teaching a class for doctoral students. So it was a relatively small class, and I got to know most of the guys in it fairly well. And the one person was a guy from a small church. And what he wanted to do his dissertation on was some resources for people who lead small churches. And I thought, oh, that makes sense. Well, I started talking to him about what he meant by small church. And I asked him, so how big is your church? And he says, well, we probably have 40 on a good day. And then he explained to me the community that he's in is a community of about 400 people. And I suddenly started doing the math on this thing. We think of who's your model for a church? Rick Warren. Okay, let's say Rick Warren has a church of 20,000 people in LA that, let's just say, round up, has 20 million people. That means 1 in 1,000 goes to his church. That means this guy could beat Rick Warren as if wife showed up half the time. Literally, 0.5 people would win, right? 0.4 would be matching Rick Warren. And suddenly you realize, oh, Rick Warren's model is totally unhelpful for a bivocational pastor of a 40-person church in a community of 400 people. Just not relevant. And we tend to do that same sort of a thing when we think of what is it like to share your faith. You think of all these big grand things. So what I'd like to do is think about all the little ordinary things. And I'm going to do that by taking a look at the Apostle Paul. Now, interestingly, the Apostle Paul, what we are not going to look at in Acts chapter 17 is the famous sermon that he preaches, because it's a perfect example of what I was just talking about that's probably a bad model. The Mars Hill sermon, people talk about all the time. It was a great moment in Paul's life. It's a significant thing. How many churches have you heard of that are named Mars Hill, right? So this is a biggie. I'm just saying the interesting stuff is what happened before he preached. And we find this beginning in Acts chapter 17, verse 16. And let me just read. It's a relatively short passage, so I'll read it all. Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons, and in the marketplace, and every day with whoever who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, what does this babbler wish to say? And others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. For you bring some strange things to our ears, and we wish to learn, therefore, what these things mean. Now the Athenians and all the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling and hearing something new. And so what is about to follow is this famous sermon. But what's interesting to me is, how did Paul get a chance to preach that famous sermon? And it's interesting that he found himself there, first observation, waiting. So what had happened earlier in this chapter is he'd got run out of town in Thessalonica, and then he went to Berea, and he got run out of town in Berea. Even though the Bereans were better, the Thessalonians followed him. And it was so bad that they sent Paul on ahead with like some guards, apparently. We don't even know their names, but a batch of people who were just making sure he got safe passage on down to Athens. And then Silas and Timothy were going to be left on back up in the area they were ministering in Macedonia around Thessalonica to finish up the work. And Paul's down here in Athens apparently killing time. So what does he do? Well, the interesting thing is he goes through a process that in effect opens a set of doors, and then he walks through them, and then he delivers an interesting message. And I just want to look at what he did to open the doors, and what he did and how he entered, and then draw a few thoughts from that for us about the kind of things that we might do, and what I'm assuming are the somewhat ordinary lives that we live on a daily basis. So first, regarding opening the doors, Paul opened the doors through openness. I know that sounds weird, but I'm just saying that's what he did. He was just open to what was going on. So the first thing he was open to is he was open to difference. He's walking around and he sees a city that is just full of idols. In fact, a saying in the ancient city regarding Athens from the ancient world, a Roman satirist said, it's easier to find a god in Athens than a man. So Athens was thick with idols and gods and beliefs and things like that. And this, of course, is a belief that Paul found repugnant. He didn't believe in the multiplicity of gods. He didn't like idol worship. But the interesting thing here is that, number one, Paul was open to see it. I'm planning on going to Greece this summer. And I just wonder if Paul had gone to Greece with the attitude that I will be bringing to Greece, what would he have missed? I'm going as a tourist. I want to go see the buildings. I want to go see all these. Well, Athens had all of those things then. But the interesting thing was he saw what was going on behind all of those things. He looks at a batch of idols, the multiplicity of them, and he kind of goes, oh, these guys are worshiping any and everything. And I wonder what's going on in their minds. And the bottom line is he didn't like the idea of multiple worshiping, all these different gods. But because he found the idea repugnant, didn't mean he found the people repugnant. And in fact, the fact that they had a different viewpoint wasn't a thing that he used to avoid them, but rather to engage them. He viewed the difference as an opportunity for a conversation, not a reason to foreclose it. He was open to that difference. And we'll come back around to some of the things that came out of that. So that was first interesting observation. Second thing is that he was open to reasoning. In verse 17, it describes this. He was provoked in spirit, so he was upset. But what was his response? To flame out on Facebook? Well, fortunately, there wasn't Facebook at the time. He couldn't go trolling anyone. But the interesting thing is that wasn't his response anyhow. He decided, let me reason with people. And in fact, this is a pattern you see throughout Acts 17, 18, and 19. There's a whole cascade of Paul reasoning and persuading and talking to people, engaging other people's minds, not sitting there telling them what's wrong with you, how dare you think that, but rather having those kinds of conversations. And the thing that I found intriguing here is that he didn't just say, hey, why don't you guys come to my church? You notice what he did? He went to their church. He went to meet them in the synagogue. He went to meet them in the marketplace where they talked. Did things on a Sabbath day. He did things on every other day. He went to where the people were and was happy to meet them on their turf. It's an interesting thing that we tend not to do. I had an interesting experience a week ago going to a mosque. It was somewhat spontaneous. I was meeting with some other faculty, but it was the day after the shooting in New Zealand. And I'm not Islamic. I don't worship as a Muslim. On the other hand, I have no interest in people going into a mosque and killing 50 people in cold blood. And I didn't want the Muslim community and my community to feel like no one cared that had happened. And so 4 of us faculty members went off to this mosque, and we just went there on their Friday worship time. And we sat there. At the end of the time, they invited one of us to come up and share just a little bit of a statement of solidarity. And I think this is the thing that I think we think the bigger the distance, the angrier we should get. And let me suggest that perhaps the bigger the distance, the more we should talk. We should build the bridges by having the conversation. Let's reason together. So that was another thing that Paul was quite willing to do, and do it, interestingly enough, on their turf. By the way, it's a little intimidating to do that, right? I was reminded of how little I know of the protocol. I walk in, I'm about to walk into the worship place with my shoes on. Bad move. That's why they have all those cubbies. I thought it was for the 1st through 3rd graders to put all their stuff in. That's for your shoes, buddy, because no one would ever walk with their shoes on into a place of worship. Where do we sit? What do we do? We knew nothing. You realize that's what everybody feels when they come to church when they've never been to a church before. Every now and then it's good for us to go to their turf, not just have them come to ours. So, third thing that Paul does in terms of opening these doors is he opened the doors through failing. Now that doesn't sound like such a great way to open doors, but I'm just making the observation. He started talking to all these people, and what did they say about him? The guy's a genius. No, they said, who is this babbler? Great word. The Greek word there that is we translate babbler is what they call an onomatopoeia. So like the word crack, where the word sounds like the sound it describes. So an onomatopoeia is that kind of a word. This Greek word is the word as it's described that's the sound of a bird picking up trash in the gutter. There's a nice phrase. Hey, did you hear Paul talk? Yeah, he sounded like a bird picking up trash in the gutter. That's what they're saying. And let me just make the observation. Apparently, they didn't find him compelling. They found him to be a babbler. Or at least some people found him to be a babbler. And you know what? Paul was okay with that. Paul was okay with that. He didn't freak out because apparently he had not measured up. You know, it's funny. I want you to stop and think of the guy who called him a babbler. What was his name? You don't know, do you? Isn't that interesting? Whose name do you know? Paul's. Yeah, 2,000 years later, we have no idea who these people were, much less what their names were. We still name our children Paul. The fact that they think you're a babbler doesn't make you wrong. That doesn't even mean you babbled. It just means, well, sometimes the response of a person tells more about them than it does about you. And so if you want to make sure you never have anyone think twice or doubt the wisdom of what you say, you'll never speak. Because people doubted Paul about this stuff too. And one of the things that allowed him to open doors was his willingness to fail. To have people say, that doesn't cut it. You sound like a babbler. The other thing is that he was also willing to succeed. So it's interesting, you have the guys that think he's a babbler, you have other people say, well, I don't think he's babbling, I think he's talking about some strange God that I don't know anything about. He's talking about Jesus and the resurrection. I don't know what to make of it, but that's what he's talking about. So they kind of get that he's talking about it. Other people are like, that's really interesting. I want to hear more. He just got the whole constellation of responses. And that's probably what we should begin to become familiar with, is that everybody won't think that what I say is great, but some people will. And let me be free to both fail and then also to succeed. And when the success comes, Paul leaned into it. He took the most of that opportunity. So the invitation that came by the handful of people who were interested was the invitation that led them giving this Mars Hill sermon that we now know so famously. So those are some things that Paul did to open the doors. Interesting thing that happens once the door opens is that anxiety about, yes, but do I walk through it, right? Two things. One is the door of opportunity being there. It's like, now that it's there, what do I do? Run the other way. There's so many options, you know. So the question is, what was it that helped make Paul enter into this? And let me just give a bit of just counsel on this. One thing is that I think we need to remember, and I think Paul was keenly aware of this, that we have way more opportunities than we think. So the first thing about walking through the open doors, there's more open doors than you think. Do you realize how it was that Paul got all these open doors? By having his plan break down and having to wait and kill time while others fix the damage back up in Macedonia, right? The plan was not to go to Athens. He was having a great time up there in Philippi and then to Thessalonica, to Berea. All these towns that were north of Athens up in Macedonia was where the plan was to go. The bottom line is the plan broke down. And Paul finds himself killing time, waiting for his companions to come down and meet him so they can get on with the plan. What was the key strategic element that Paul used to open the doors? Waiting. Are you short on opportunities? Here's my suggestion. Go to the DMV. What better place to wait, right? They've elevated waiting to an art form. I just went there to try and get something in my car. I thought I was going to die in the DMV. If you need an opportunity to share your faith, go find a place to wait. There it is. So Paul's killing time. And we get wound up with our strategy, got to do this, got to do that. And I think it is clearly true in the life of both Paul and Jesus that usually the very, very best of opportunities, the most famous things we know about them, being a Mars Hill sermon or preaching to the 5,000, were basically either waiting or interruption. They were not the plan, they were God's interjection into the plan. And the key thing is that Paul's openness to that allowed him to go ahead and walk to that door. He said, okay, I'm waiting, but I'm not going to wait passively. I'm going to do things in the time that I have it. Second interesting thing in terms of going ahead and walking to the door is we have way more in common with people than we often think we do. And this is the thing that I think has become even more problematic in the last several years as our nation polarizes. We begin to think all kinds of strange thoughts about the people who are on the other side. This very much goes both or all directions. Interesting. So Paul sees this batch of people who are worshiping an unknown God. But not only that, they're worshiping like 10,000 other gods that they seem to know a name for. And then it kind of dawns on me, the bottom line is this is a bunch of people who are worshiping gods, but somehow their worship of the gods isn't working for them, right? Number one, because they keep adding more gods, and number two, they don't even have a name for the gods, so they're just covering all the bases. So we'll get the unknown one thrown in here too. And suddenly Paul thinks, wait a minute, I know a guy who was actively religious and worshiping God, but it wasn't working for him. His name was me, right? And suddenly Paul finds his Jewish faith wasn't working. He has an encounter with Jesus on Damascus Road, and suddenly he realizes there's a better way. So he's looking at these batch of idol worshipers, and you could just look at them and say, yeah, a bunch of pagan idol worshipers. Paul looks at them in some sense and says, these guys are just like me. They had a religious impulse that wasn't working for them. Let me meet them on their common ground. He does the same thing with the Epicureans. So you have Epicurean philosophers who are there. And the Epicureans were people who variety of interesting things about Epicurean philosophy. The one thing that's most relevant in this particular passage is that they were the guys who were bugged by all the superstition. How many gods? Really, guys? More gods than people? You got to be joking. They were the skeptics, they were the cynics, they were the cold hard reason sort of people there. And they were very doubtful about all the stuff that's going on. They wanted good reasons for belief. Who does that sound like? Paul, right? The guy we find reasoning with everybody all through the book of Acts. And Paul's like, oh, Epicurean philosopher, I get it. I'm just like you. And they got a Stoic philosopher who comes around. The Stoics were different, significantly different school of philosophy than the Epicureans were. But these were a batch of people who are basically saying they think there's a God, they think there's nature. In some ways, nature is God's body. With it comes a set of laws, and the bottom line is we have little control over these things, so we need to learn to suffer. That's where we get the phrase stoically suffering. You don't show your pain or your anguish. This is sort of their orientation, but a big part of that is that we're all in the common thing, a common sense of humanity, and from the created order we all draw our life. You remember the words that Paul will use shortly about in him we live and move and have our being. Almost a direct connection. I think it might actually literally be a quote from a Stoic philosopher. Paul agrees with him on that point. And you know what Paul's doing here is just playing up the points of agreement rather than the points of disagreement. And obviously it's not because he's never going to get to the points where they disagree, but he wants them to say, you know what? I'm way more like you than you think we are. And I think we've gotten particularly bad at this issue. I was thinking about this many years ago when I was in graduate school, I did my PhD in philosophy on the issue of abortion at UC Riverside, which I've discovered is not the hotbed of the pro-life movement. So everything I argued for was going to be disputed by everyone who read what I was writing. I knew this when I started the whole enterprise. So I was assuming all these things we didn't hold in common. And there was a fair bit of that was actually true, but I actually had a great experience there, worked with some great folks, no complaints about that experience. But I was talking to a friend of mine a little later who had ended up involved with a bunch of things in Washington with the FDA, was sitting on a bunch of boards of people who dealt with some issues related to birth control and things like that. And he made this interesting comment to me. He says, Rick, he was an evangelical Christian, but he said, I'm always amazed at how much we have in common with all of these other people in the room there. And I go, well, what do you mean? He says, well, look, when I sit in a room with all these people, all of them are indeed people who are in favor of abortion. But the interesting thing is, I could also word it a different way. Everybody in that room agrees that abortion should be had as seldom as possible. No one likes abortion itself. I believe it was actually Hillary Clinton who made the phrase, or maybe Bill, that abortion should be clean, safe, or something, and rare. And that's capturing that notion where you're like, yeah, this isn't a thing you would ever want to do. That's a thing that other people would share with a person who's pro-life, who certainly thinks we shouldn't be doing these things. The interesting thing is that there's also people who say, well, I think it's good for a woman to be able to have control over her own body. Well, that has a certain intuitive appeal to me too. In fact, a lot of that stuff went on in my dissertation. Those are things I had to talk about. And he said, you know, the interesting thing is what we disagree is how we weigh these conflicting principles that we both share. But we act like we share nothing at all. We think that this person, I know they look like a human, but when they walk home and go into the bathroom and take off their hair, there's at least 3 tentacles that stick out the back of their brain because I'm sure they must be from another planet. And we have that mindset about people on the, quote, other side, so we have no hope or interest in meeting them in the midst of our common ground. And the thing that Paul was great at doing is saying, hey, Epicurean philosopher absolutely denies the reality of God or any gods. But nonetheless, it's interesting how much we have in common. We both want to reason about God. Let's do some reasoning together. So he's a great model in that sense of finding and using, appealing to the common ground. So with that laid out here, let me just give a few practical tips for doing and engaging these things, because the goal isn't to think better about speaking Christianly. The goal is to actually do it. So a couple of quick thoughts in this round to close. It's way better to be an interested person than an interesting person. It's way better to be interested in others than try to be interesting to them. I learned this from a friend of mine who had gone off to Stanford as an undergrad, and one of the people he met there as a professor was a guy I think had been in, Kennedy's or maybe Nixon's cabinet or something like that, a very high level political person, cabinet level person, who had ended up, going out of politics, becoming a professor. And my friend had him and just loved the guy, thought he was fantastic, and so he kind of became a mentor to him, and he's in there talking to him and, going for office hours and things, and he's about halfway through this conversation with him, and the guy just kind of puts up his finger like that, the pause button. And he said, you're trying really hard to be an interesting person. You should try to be an interested person. My friend told me that story 35 years later. Never left him. And the idea that let me paint my stuff so it's super interesting as opposed to being super interested in who you are and what you're doing. I had an interesting experience. I'm just thinking about this connection at UC Riverside. I was down there and I was sitting out in kind of the open quad there, and one of the other grad students came walking by, and he's the guy I knew. We were in a seminar together, but we didn't know each other well. We never talked to each other, knew each other's names. But I saw him, I said hi, he stopped and said hi. And then I don't know what hit me, but I just said, you know what? Let me just ask him a question. I said, I'm just curious. How was it that you ever fell in love with philosophy? I mean, he's a philosophy grad student, right? So he must have. And he laughs and he goes, oh, that's a funny story. I said, tell me. He says, well, I was trying to get into a class, and the bottom line is, he was trying to get into a class he couldn't. The only class he'd get to replace it that fit in the time slot was a philosophy class. And he sits down in his class, had no interest in being there. They hand out the books. He's picking up, supposed to read Plato's Republic, starts reading Plato's Republic, and he's absolutely fascinated by it. I know that's hard to believe. I'm not making this stuff up. It's true. So, and next thing you know, he's a philosophy major. Next thing you know, he's trying to get his PhD in philosophy. So he starts going off on this 45-minute story. And, he was all into it. And then he gets to the end, how that funny moment where you're like, am I talking too much? He just doesn't know. And he has that really pause and conversation. What do you suppose he did once he had that realization? He turned around and asked me the same question. How did you fall in love with philosophy? That was my chance to speak Christianly. It was interesting. I said, well, for me, I'm a Christian, and the place in a university where you get to ask all the big questions, I love the big question of life. What happens when we die? Is there a God? What makes things right and wrong? All these sorts of things. These are big deals for any religion, and particularly the Christian faith. I'm fascinated by those things, and the place you get to talk about that in the university is the philosophy department. So that's why I'm a philosophy student. It's great. We had about another 15-minute conversation about all this stuff. The whole entree to that was simply being interested instead of trying to be interesting. It'd be good. You guys are thinking about people that you know, that you want to be praying for. Let me encourage you to make that the next step that you do. Not to go, how will I share my faith? Is how will I ask them about something they're interested in? It might be the movies that they like to go to. It might be the fact that they're always working on their boat in their backyard. It doesn't matter. Find out what they're interested in and be interested too. It becomes an open door for way more conversation. And by the way, I know I don't have to tell you this because you get this experience all the time. It doesn't work to act like you're interested. You need to actually be interested. Ever had the salesman walk, hey, I see all those flowers out in front. You must really like that. And he starts talking like he's interested in flowers, but you realize he just wants to sell me a Kirby vacuum cleaner. That's the only reason he's talking about flowers. The bottom line is you need to make up your mind that you really do want to love others. And one of the very best ways that we show love for other people is by giving them the gift we give to the fewest people of anything, and that is the gift of our attention. That we actually care and pay attention to who they are and what they care about. So, first point of action, be interested, not interesting. Second thing, learn to laugh at yourself. The bottom line is you're way funnier than you think you are. So we try and explain stuff away and things like that, and we get really worried that maybe we won't get it all right, and maybe this person will have a rebuttal, and then I'll be trapped, and what I'll say won't have worked out right, and you're like, oh no, what will I do? Maybe I will say something and they'll accuse me of being a babbler. Oh, that would be terrible. But here's a thought. I hate to bring it up, but maybe you will have actually babbled. It happens. We don't know everything, right? So here's a magic line. I recommend that you write it down and memorize it. It will get you out of any jam in any situation. It's very simple. Say, laugh, and then say, you know what I love about you is you make me think better. You know what I love about you? You make me think better. Did you ever stop and think the unanswered question, or perhaps to you unanswerable question, is an invitation for further conversation? They aren't talking to you because they thought, is it possible that Rick is God? I don't think that went through their mind. They're not expecting you to have every answer. And the fact that you don't makes them realize, oh, this is a person who perhaps is a little bit more like me than I thought. And perhaps if they're like me, the things that have worked for them might work for me too. There is a huge virtue in not knowing all of the answers, not advice. And we need to be able to be welcoming of that. And like I say, just laugh. Laugh at yourself when you're funny, even if you weren't trying to be. It's not a crime, and it's one of the most endearing and welcoming things you can do for another person. It lowers the tension. The other thing that's really cool is when you get stumped by one of those questions, it's always an invitation to come back and say, hey, I've been thinking about that question. Like I said, you make me think better. So let me try this. Does this help? And you can follow up on the conversation. It's a wonderful way to deepen a conversation, not to end it. One final thought. Another burden that I think we bear when we get into a discussion, particularly as it moves more closely to actually the gospel itself, not simply speaking Christianly, but actually conveying the gospel, talking to people about a decision, is I think we suddenly feel like we've got to argue the case for God. It's like God is on trial, and for some weird reason, you've been appointed the attorney. And then the tension begins to rise. You're thinking, okay, that would be a real bummer if someone said, hey, what were you doing last week? Oh, I was the defense attorney for God. How'd it come out? He was convicted. See, that would sound really bad, right? And we get really nervous if you're the attorney and God is on trial and you're afraid he's going to be in deep trouble after. It's like, oh no, what will I do? Let me get this cleared up once and for all. Very simple. I've read through the whole Bible. I've discovered something. You're never called to be an attorney for Christ. You're called to be a witness. You know the easiest job in the courtroom? The witness. The witness just comes in, I don't really know what was happening, but I saw this guy come out and he drove his car off that way and he hit the person going the other way. Genius. How did you figure that out? You're just sharing what happened. Perfect example, the blind man in John chapter 9. He doesn't even know who healed him. He didn't even know it was Jesus. Just some guy shows up, spits on some stuff, puts on the next thing, now I see. And they bring him back in. Well, what exactly happened? They keep grilling. Finally says, what's wrong with you guys? The bottom line is, I used to be blind, now I see. If you want more information, go talk to him. Are you trying to go worship him too? Of course, at that point, they all blow up. But he's like, guys, I'm a witness. I'm not the attorney. So one of the great things we do is to be a witness. You may have heard people encourage you should prepare your testimony so you can share your testimony. That's great. I encourage you to do that story of how you came to Christ. Let me encourage you, though, not just to have a testimony, but to have testimonies. That at the drop of a hat, you're willing and able to tell the story of something that God has done in your life. It's an opportunity to speak Christianly. And it isn't always about the moment of conversion. It's like, hey, here's what's going on. It's an invitation for further conversation. Good example is for me, both of my parents have passed away in the past few years. I have been confronted with my own mortality in that. And it's interesting to just be able to talk to persons non-believing and say, yeah. And even to include the fact, I'm a Christian, so we think a lot about life after death. But when my parents both died, I suddenly realized I think about it real differently when suddenly it's somehow affecting me. And I found it way harder than I thought it would be. Could I just suggest that's a testimony? And that the likely response to that is an open conversation? To stop and think, how has God led you in a moment of confusion? Or perhaps to share, I'm in a moment of confusion and I'm lacking the leading right now. The point is to be able to open up that part of our lives to share it with others that they might join in conversing with it as well. An invitation to conversation. So, in terms of action point, let me just make it really simple. You guys, it sounds like, are already thinking about people. Here would be my plea, is that when you think about the people that you would like to share your faith with, that you don't simply think about the final close the deal part of this, but say, what are questions I might ask this person? Or what are testimonies, not the testimony, but just stories of how God has somehow been working in my life that I might be able to share with this person. And do those pre-things as opposed to just thinking the only thing that you can do is the everything that you might do. Because usually when we try to do everything, we end up doing nothing. Let me pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for the gift of the gospel. We thank you for the incredible gift of belief and the joy and privilege of walking with you. And Lord, we want to be people who don't keep that gift to ourselves. So Lord, I pray you give us the grace to be people who actually do learn to talk Christianly. And in so doing that we offer, in effect, open invitations for others to come and see, to hear more, to talk more, that we become a bridge to them to finding Jesus. Lord, give us the grace to do that for those you place around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.